This video is sponsored by the Cascade Clash, a competitively focused gaming event with a full-sized 40k major being held in Washington State, USA. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is Best Armies in 40k, the weekly video series where we go through large event data over the past weekend and pick out the best armies to talk about. Now, this is going to be a very special episode of the series because last week we saw the new balanced data slate arrive for Warhammer 40k, which rebalanced a lot of the game, changing some core rules, a lot of points values, and some faction mechanics. And many events this weekend did not use the data slate because it came out relatively late, and events usually like to give players at least a week or two to adjust to new rules changes. However, several events did use these changes, and those are what we're going to be focusing on today. I'm going to be diving through the 3 events that I found this weekend that used the updated balanced data slate, those being the 56-player Captain Con that I actually streamed over on this channel. If you want to watch live games from the Captain Con GT, we streamed some amazing games from that event, and it was super fun the entire time, so highly recommend you go check those VODs out. The 34-player Great Game Gongai GT, as well as the 26-player Black Hole Wars. I'm going to take the top 3 of each of these events and discuss them each briefly. Most of these only had a single undefeated, so we're going to be talking about some X and 1 lists, but they are interesting and have some absolutely wild includes. A little bit of a spoiler, there is a Seraptek heavy construct in this video, which is exciting. So let's dive in, but first, sponsor time. With the new year and the new competitive Warhammer 40k season comes a deluge of competitive events. A veritable waterfall of them. One could even call it a cascade. And one of the best of them is the Cascade Clash. Cascade Clash is a new competitively focused tabletop gaming convention held March 8th through 10th in Mount Vernon, Washington, and is presented by Aegis Games. While the event holds a variety of competitive gaming tournaments, we're here to talk about Warhammer. The highlight of the Cascade Clash is a 3-day, 8-round, 150-player Warhammer 40k major. The event is being organized by an experienced judge team drawn from successful competitive Warhammer 40k players. And they formulated a packet specifically to alleviate many of the pain points experienced by other large events in the field. And they're also offering a frankly ludicrous amount of prize support. This includes prizes for best painting and best overall, best sportsman, best in faction, and even best in record. The event is being held on the Skagit County Fairgrounds with pretty reasonable travel distance from both SeaTac and Bellingham Airport, and includes a shuttle service from SeaTac if you're flying in. So there's many options to travel to the event. So follow the links down in the pinned comment and video description for more information about the Cascade Clash and the Warhammer 40k major being held there. Don't forget to mark your calendars March 8th through 10th and get ready for the Clash. So first, let's discuss the largest event of the weekend, the Captain Con GT. Now we'll move in ascending order and start with 3rd place, where James Watkins took Orks to a 4-1 record. Orks largely got side graded in this new balance update, and I think already being a relatively strong faction means that they are going to be looking pretty tasty in the new season. James was playing a Beast Boss on Squigosaur with Headwop as Killchoppa, Captain Badrock, Mozrog Scragbad, as well as 2 War Bosses, one with Foul Melads and one with Cunning but Brutal to allow fallback and charge. We then had 3 trucks, but those are going to be carrying around the War Boss's bodyguards as well as Captain Badrock's flash kits. Speaking of those bodyguards, we had 2 units of 10 Knobs, 1 unit of 10 flash kits, as well as a unit of 10 Gretchen to act as support. We then had 3 units of 3 Squighog Boys and 2 units of Storm Boys to add some additional fast movers as well as secondary objective scorers. While we did see some other lists at the event running heavier vehicles with the newly discounted units like battle wagons and kill rigs, this list is focused on a relatively classic truck-oriented build, filling them with very powerful melee threats like the Knobs, and supporting them with the 2 Squigosaur riders, Mozrog Scragbad and the Squigosaur Beast Boss, as well as some shooting from Captain Badrock. Overall, a pretty solid list. It puts a lot of aggression on the table. It's extremely good in melee, and it scores incredibly well with the Gretchen, Storm Boys, Squighog Boys, and even the trucks themselves all available to score either tactical or fixed secondaries, depending on the situation. And that moves us on to the 2nd place placer in the Captain Con GT, Casey Casey Glynn, and here we see our first Necrons of the weekend. Casey was playing a Hyper Crypt Legion. Now, this is a kind of Matt Laura style of build that we saw Matt win the LVO with, and I have several videos about this style of army, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it does run 2 Chronomancers, one with Dimensional Overseer to allow additional units to hyperphase around the table, one with the Osteoclave Fulcrum, 2 Catan Shards, one of the Nightbringer, one of the Void Dragon. This adds a lot of resilient power in the center of the table and is able to put a lot of pressure on the opponent while creating space for your units to hyperphase into relevant positions. Illuminor Seraz to buff the 3 units of Immortals that are in the battle line, Umatek the Stormlord to fuel you with some CP, as well as a Planesmancer with the Risen Tyrant to give his unit rerolls when they reserve. We then had 3 units of Immortals, 2 with Gauss Blasters to attach those Chronomancers into, so they're able to fire and then move onto objectives. 1 with the Tesla Carbines. These guys are going to be getting 5+ critical hits from the Plasmancer, which then turn into Sustain 2 thanks to the Tesla effect, and are easy to trigger thanks to rerolls from a Risen Tyrant. We then had 2 units of Canoptic Scarab Swarms, 3 of each. Those guys are just going to be performing some actions in the center of the table. A unit of Death Marks. These guys have Deep Strike innately, so they're going to be able to hyperphase and use Deep Strike redeployment in order to set back up. 3 individual Locust Destroyers to perform actions, and last but certainly not least, a Monolith. The Monolith has Deep Strike innately, so it is able to use its Deep Strike setup when it hyperphases. It can then bring the Immortals out of its Eternity Gate, fire if they have a Chronomancer attached, and then move to steal objectives and get absolutely insane angles. So it's extremely difficult to prevent them getting into your important utility units. And with those relatively long-range guns and lethal hits with solid AP from the Gauss Blasters and insane infantry clearing from the Plasmancer unit, they are able to do extreme damage. Overall, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of this build moving on into the near future. It's incredibly strong. Obviously, it wouldn't have won LVO if it wasn't very good. And given that a lot of the other top factions in the game have been depowered a little bit, I think it's looking like it's probably going to be the #1 archetype moving on into the beginning of this season. And that moves us on to the #1 placer. This was Colin Burns running Aeldari. Now, Aeldari did get one of the heaviest hits in the Dataslate update, tons of nerfs across their abilities, faction abilities, a couple points changes, and some of their core units did get depowered, but Colin was not running any units that saw mechanical changes. Only changes to the Battle Host Detachment and the Army rule were relevant for this army. He was running a Foot Autarch, not an Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem, so although he doesn't have Lone Operative and it doesn't move quite as fast as the Autarch Wayleaper, the standard Autarch is difficult to kill because if you direct your indirect fire onto him, there is a 2+ chance that he will just regenerate thanks to that Phoenix Gem. We had Fugan alongside Illic Nightspear, Karandros, and a Solitaire. The army was built around 3 units of Fire Dragons. One of them obviously would attach Fugan into it to give his +1 to hit to the unit. Those were all embarked into 3 Falcons. The Falcon's fire support gives the Fire Dragons rerolls to wound if they target whatever the Falcon attacked, and given the fact that Falcons are relatively fast and can move and then disembark those Fire Dragons, they have an insane Alpha Strike potential, and especially alongside the use of a couple of Strands of Fate dice can deal absolutely ludicrous damage. We then had a unit of 10 Rangers to make use of Illic Nightspear's bonus to wound and his Lone Operative to the unit to make them incredibly difficult to engage with. 2 units of Shroud Runners to add some Alpha Strike potential. Really good infantry sweeping. So we have a varied array of attacks in this list. Shroud Runners can deal with Horde units. Fire Dragons can deal with armored units. Basically, any target that you come up against, you have some sort of answer. And the Shroud Runners will also grant lethal hits to other Aeldari units against an enemy within 12 inches of them. That can make the army on the whole a little bit more effective against high toughness enemies. We then had a unit of Striking Scorpions to add an infiltrating option, 1 unit of Swooping Hawks to complete secondary objectives, and a unit of 10 Warp Spiders. One big thing that this army is focusing on is the use of Fire and Fade instead of Phantasm. While Phantasm is still an incredible tool in the Battle Host toolbox, it is not very reliable. However, Fire and Fade is. And units like Warp Spiders, these big units of Shroud Runners, and the big Ranger squad can move out aggressively, get the shots that they want, and then if you have the 2 CP banked from the Autarch, then use Fire and Fade to retreat to safety. It is much less flexible than Phantasm was, but has largely the same effect. And if you haven't played against these 10-man Warp Spider units, they are disgusting. Able to move 24 inches, fire 11d6 devastating wound torrent weapons. If they elect to stay there, potentially overwatch you, or they can pay 2 CP and Fire and Fade back into a safe position in order to do it again next turn. They're hard to engage with, they do insane damage against most targets, and are generally very obnoxious. This is a very interesting archetype of Aeldari. We saw it very briefly in the lead up to this balance update, and it basically got almost no changes in the balance update. Obviously, the Phantasm change does change it a lot, but the fact that it's so MSU oriented, it has so many tiny units in the build that are going to be independently getting the battle host rerolls, targeting whenever they want, and spreading across the table. The fact that you can't Phantasm one unit quite as effectively as you could is not that big of a deal. The army's okay with losing a couple of these small combat units and coming back stronger with the insane efficiency of Aeldari shooting. While we may see some changes to an archetype like this, I think builds that look a lot like this are going to be the face of Aeldari moving forward. I think we're going to see less of a focus on the big 10-man bricks of things like Wraithguard that are expensive, and more of a focus on the smaller Aspect Warrior units. And with that, let's move on to the next event, the Great Game Gongai GT. Starting in third place, Jonathan Siebert went 4-1 with Leagues of Votann. Now, Leagues of Votann did see a lot of changes to their more spammable units. We saw things like Brokir Thunderkin and Sagittors go up in points value. So this list is not focused as much on the Sagittors and the cheaper MSU style units and more focused on the larger Hecaton land fortresses. We had one Brokir Ironmaster alongside 2 Einhir Champions, one with Appraising Glare, 2 units of Hearthkin Warriors alongside 2 Sagittors. Those Hearthkin Warriors were likely split into combat squads inside the Sagittors. We then had 2 units of Chthonian Berserks. Those could embark into 2 of the land fortresses, and you can mix and match them with the combat squads out of the Hearthkin Warriors, depending on what you need. Either embarking 10 Hearthkin Warriors into a land fortress, keeping them all together, or splitting them between the Sagittor and the land fortress, and also keeping the Chthonian Berserks inside. So a lot of interesting decision making to do when you come to the battle formation step. We then had 6 Brokir Thunderkin, not quite the spam of 12 or 15 that we saw previously, but still a good unit to come off a table edge and deal some serious damage, especially to vehicles. We then saw 2 units of Einhir Hearthguard. These are only 5-man units, not the 10 that we're typically used to seeing. Both of them equipped with Plasma Blades and Vulcanite Disintegrators. We then had 2 units of Hernkin Pioneers to add a little bit of utility to the unit. One thing I think is really interesting about Leagues of Votann is that despite the fact that they are a very limited codex and only have a very limited number of datasheets available to them, Votann was still able to build several different archetypes, either focusing on mass scouting units, heavier deep striking units like Einhir Hearthguard, or the big heavily armored land fortresses, or a smattering of the 3. And that build flexibility means that they don't have to focus quite on the spammy units like those Sagittors that did see that points increase, and makes it harder for you to take them in bricks of 6. With that, we'll move on to the next list. Alex Henderson, who took second place with Chaos Knights. Alex was running a classic carnivore spam, but now with the new changes to the demonic ally abilities, and it's difficult to take demonic allies that are not battle line, we actually elected to leave all of those at home, instead taking, I believe, what is the maximum number of war dogs available. Or at least close to it. War Dog Brigands did see a points increase, and those were probably the most efficient War Dog or Armiger chassis unit in the game, but now at 170 points, they're a little bit harder of an include. The list only includes 3 of those, and led by a War Dog Stalker with Aura of Terror, but then also takes 3 War Dog Huntsmen and the full 6 melee-oriented War Dog Carnivores. Fascinating to see Chaos Knights without any of their demonic allies available, but when you have 13 War Dogs, it becomes much more possible to score your secondaries by just simply using your War Dog Carnivores to perform actions or move them into areas of the table to gain those secondary objective points. At only 140 points, and with a relatively fast movement alongside access to Knights of Shade to move through walls, the War Dog Carnivores are not only an incredibly fast, lethal melee threat, but also good at just maneuvering around and completing your board control and maneuver focused secondaries. And with that, we'll move to the top list in the event. Tanner Hebert, who went 5-0 with Death Guard. Death Guard saw a lot of changes in the update, not only to demonic allies, but also to the brigands that they usually took as allies, and some points increases to Plague Marines. And so we are seeing a little bit of a refocus from those units to the other options in the Death Guard index. This list was led by Mortarion and also included Typhus, who at a new 80-point cost, I think is kind of an auto-include in most Death Guard builds. This dude does insane damage with his psychic power. He can act, if you want to, as a single entity Deep Striker for only 80 points, which is solid. He's not the easiest thing to kill, and he's very good in melee as well. He's also very good when attached into a Death Shroud Terminator squad, which I think this list is doing, because it's making use of the newly discounted Death Shroud Terminators and including 3 units of 3 of them. The other 2 most likely attached in the 2 Terminator Sorcerers that are also inside the list. These guys have access to their Psychic Familiar to supercharge their psychic weapons, giving them an incredibly powerful ranged attack or even an incredibly powerful melee attack once per game, and also in reducing incoming damage by 1 in the fight phase for those Death Shroud Terminator units, make them very tanky in the center of the table, especially against melee focused enemies. We then had 2 Foul Blightspawn, 2 Biologus Putrefiers to attach in 2 units of 10 Plague Marines. Those would embark into 2 Rhinos, so the Plague Marine rush is alive and well, just not the 40 or 60 Plague Marines that we typically saw previously before their points increased. In addition to 1 unit of 3 Nurglings and 2 War Dog Brigands, little bit less efficient with their new points increases, but we are still seeing the Death Guard classic synergy with allies. Pretty interesting list, moving away from the heavy armored units like Plague Burst Crawlers and more to these Terminator focused units. An interesting direction for the faction to go in, but clearly it worked out for Tanner because he won all his games. And with that, we will move into the last event that we're going to talk about today, Black Hole Wars 2024. The first list we're going to talk about today is the 3rd place finisher, Daniel Moriera, playing Adepta Sororitas. Now, Adepta Sororitas saw some changes to their most common list archetype, which included the Triumph of St. Catherine alongside units like the Palatine and Dialogus that synergized with its infinite ability to perform acts of faith in an aura. However, that has been nerfed to only 2 times per phase instead of the single time per phase that units are typically restricted to. So it has been removed from this list, and instead this list is focused incredibly heavily on scoring focused units. The list is led by Morven Val, being the only character that it's taking, alongside a Battle Sisters squad, 1 Immolator and 3 Sororitas Rhinos. Those Rhinos embarking some selection of the massive number of melee units in the list. This included 2 units of 10 Repentia, as well as 3 units of 10 Arcoflagellants. While the Arcoflagellants are a known quantity, they are incredibly powerful with a massive number of attacks and strong resilience as well. The Repentia are a little bit less played, but what they do offer is a higher AP multi-damage attack over that of the Arcoflagellants. And while they're easier to kill and don't have as many wounds and don't have as many attacks or the consistency that Arcoflagellants do, they are a lot cheaper. And if you need to trade them for medium infantry units or even do damage to vehicles, Repentia are here for you. We then had 1 unit of Paragon Warsuits for Morven Val to join into, 3 Crusader squads to act as utility, and speaking of utility, we're also recreating the Descent of the Angels with 3 units of Seraphim, as well as 3 units of the newly discounted Zephyrim. While this list didn't have a ton of shooting, Morven Val can act as a pretty strong fire base to disincentivize your opponent from moving out in the open, but anything that was hiding away from her shooting would be rooted out by the massive number of Arcoflagellants and Repentia, alongside the insane number of scoring units. 3 units of Seraphim, 3 units of Zephyrim, and 3 Crusaders means that this army is incredibly good at screening, incredibly good at controlling the table, and incredibly good at scoring secondary objectives. This list ended the event with multiple 100-point wins on its record, and one of the highest victory point totals out of the event, and I can absolutely understand why, with the massive amount of utility that Daniel was bringing into his army. And with that, we'll move on to the next list, and this one is an absolute doozy. In second place, we had João Figueiredo running a Hypercrypt Legion. But this isn't your daddy's Hypercrypt Legion that we talked about in the previous event. This one was led by none other than the Silent King himself, backed up by a Catan Shard of the Nightbringer and Trazyn the Infinite. We also had a Chronomancer to attach into a unit of 10 Immortals to use the combinations that we've been talking about previously with their ability to deep strike around the table using the Hypercrypt Legion's hyperphasing and then fire and move thanks to the Chronomancer. We then had 2 units of Triarch Praetorians. These guys are the jump infantry equivalent Triarch units and do have deep strike built in, so they're able to use hyperphasing to deep strike themselves rather than using the normal strategic reserve, alongside 3 Locust Destroyers and a unit of Canoptic Scarab Swarms to act as utility. We then had a unit of heavy Locust Destroyers, these ones bringing Gauss Destructors to add some anti-tank, and speaking of anti-tank, we also had a Seraptek Heavy Construct with 2 Singularity Generators. The Seraptek Heavy Construct is a massive Knight equivalent Forge World unit available for Necrons, and we did see a little bit of play with this big guy back in Awakened Dynasty at the dawn of the edition, but since the Codex has released, the interactions with it have been nerfed. However, it does have a lot of synergy with Hypercrypt Legion, since it's able to use hyper hyper-phasing to reposition itself around the table. Well, I believe it may be too large to actually strategic reserve 6 inches off the table edge. That is what Cosmic Precision is for, allowing the Seraptek construct to deep strike 3 inches away from enemies anywhere on the table, regardless of its proximity to table edges, meaning that it's almost impossible to prevent this thing from getting line of sight to you. And that is devastating because those 2 Singularity generators are firing a grand total of 4d6 blast attacks at strength 10, AP 3, 4 damage with devastating wounds. One of the big benefits of Hypercryptlegion is that it gives you the ability to reposition big heavy guns, so it's incredibly difficult to avoid their lines of fire, and the Seraptek Heavy Construct was definitely using that ability in this list. It's also bringing a very impressive OC of 10 to bear, so it's even good at taking enemy objectives away if they don't correctly screen out the Cosmic Precision drop. And with the Silent King standing nearby, it's able to make use of his modal aura abilities. This includes ignoring modifiers, so effects like stealth or wound penalties won't be an issue for the Seraptek construct, or re-rolling hit and wound rolls of 1, making you more likely to convert those enormous strength 10 4 damage attacks into devastating wounds. This combination is absolutely sick. The Silent King himself can also use the hyperphasing ability, since it just gets it from the detachment, meaning that his enormous brick of power can jump around the table, putting his 2 scepter attacks as well as the 6 damage annihilator beams from his 2 Menhirs into line of sight of juicy targets, and again making it incredibly difficult to avoid this guy. He has a much easier time coming off the table, and he can come in 6 inches of wherever the Seraptek construct is dropping down in order to buff it, and the 2 of them are probably together able to deal with most threats in the game fairly easily. This list is incredibly creative and clearly effective, since we saw it go 4-1 to a 2nd place finish in this event, and it's super cool to see lists like this come out of the woodwork now that Necrons have a little bit more veterancy under their belt. Now with that, we will move on to the top placing list in the event, and we are going to largely skip this one, but I do want to give a shout out to Vitor Pereira, who did go 5-0 undefeated with another Hypercryptlegion. This list is almost identical. Actually, I think it might just literally be identical to Casey Glynn's list that we talked about from Captain Con. It is at this point a pretty classic Matt Laura style build that we discussed earlier. And with that, those are the best lists in Warhammer 40k post Dataslate. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these lists, whether you think you're going to pick up a Seraptek Heavy Construct in order to run that in the future, and if you're excited about the new balance update. I know this one has been relatively controversial, a lot of changes here and there. It's cool to see armies like Chaos Knights and Death Guard do well, despite the fact that their factions did largely get side grades and in some cases debuffs. And it's also interesting to see how dominant Necrons are, at least at this beginning stage. Curious to see whether or not they continue to be as dominant as they have been, or whether we start to formulate answers for this Hypercryptlegion style of list, but it's going to be an exciting time. And with that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. I love you all. You're amazing people, and you're beautiful and handsome and super smart. And then remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.